Okay, take 3. Today I want to talk about the works of Foucault and Barthes. Obviously, they discuss the role of the author, the concept of authorship, how it affects, why not it actually makes sense, and what the social implications are. And then I want to use their ideas to analyze Bloom's work, Elegiac Conclusion, and see how the concept of authorship sort of implicitly plays out in his argumentation. But before we get into all that content, it helps to consider the historical development of the concept of authorship. So before modern times, really up until the Middle Ages, there was authors weren't really ascribed to works of fiction, which makes sense if you're thinking about the world as not recording in written form, basically everything. Stories could be passed orally, and it would just be infeasible back then to keep track of who had written everything. And so a kind of curious artifact of this is that we get works like the Iliad and Odyssey, which are highly regarded, and we say they're written by Homer, but we don't actually know anything about Homer, and in fact don't really know if he's a single person or a group of people. So it's kind of odd, but it was just the way things happened pre-Middle Ages. Another odd thing in that time is that there really wasn't a role for authors in the sciences. Like Galileo, for example, could tell you all about that because he was persecuted by the Catholic Church, for being a scientist and saying things that seemed blasphemous. But then in the 16 or 1700s, we get what is sort of the birth of the author, and the roles of the author in literature and science switch. So now, which makes a lot more sense to us today in science, the author, if you heard of a new experiment done by a scientist that whose work you knew about, you might be excited about it because you're interested in that work. But you wouldn't think it was any more true, for example, than the work of any other scientist, because ultimately we believe that scientific works are subject to reproducibility, they have to hold up to experimentation. And so in some sense, the author doesn't really play much of a role. On the other hand, in literature, it clearly does. People think about, who wrote a work, and it has an important social function. And there's kind of a spectrum that we see today. So if you kind of cut in the middle between hard sciences and literature to social sciences, you thought about the works of Malcolm Gladwell, for example. Obviously, there's a role of the author there because there's a social function to that name. If Malcolm Gladwell publishes a new book, it means something to people. They're more likely to buy it because they've heard his name already, right? But at the same time, he's publishing things that are nonfiction, so he has to cite references in the back of the book, and to some extent that sort of seeds his authorship, seeds the amount of authority that his name carries, because it's dependent upon the quality of his argument. Anyway, that's sort of the evolution of authorship up until the present day. Now I want to consider why the concept of authorship may or may not make sense. So Barthes writes, every text is eternally here and now, which is to say that when you're reading a book, it's only working on you in the present. You're only analyzing or thinking about it in the present. The author exists, or the work he was doing when he was writing the text exists in the past. And so there's this temporal disconnect. So that's one kind of germ of an idea which might suggest to you that approaching the text with the idea in mind that this was written by this particular guy or woman who was raised in this historical or cultural context, that might not be the appropriate way to be thinking about the book, because those things were all in the past, and the book is only existing right now, like for your purposes. Another thing Barthes writes is the language which it is the language which speaks, not the author. And so that's like an obvious distinction, sort of, but it's an important one, right? Because the person, the actual author, you can't ask follow-up questions to. They're not there. It's only the sentences that you have access to. So, it kind of doesn't make sense to just speculate about what, like, the author was thinking, for example, because it's just an impractical thing. You don't have access to that. And then a final argument on this front is that authorship arguably assigns more credit to the writer than there really do, because writing never takes place in a vacuum. Nobody's completely original, and to put this single name on the cover of a book as if that person like created all of it from nothing is a little bit disingenuous. It gives no credit to all the authors that writer has read in their lifetime, which is probably a lot, right? So it's a little bit misleading. So what are the implications of establishing authorship, like on a societal level? Well, one that I think I mentioned earlier was that it makes reappropriation harder. So, like copyright laws, like are a natural thing to create after you start acknowledging the role of the author. And this isn't like an exclusively bad thing. It's good to acknowledge like when people do good creative work, but it is a notable effect of establishing authorship, like as a society or a culture. And it's also not exclusively good either. It seems like being able to reappropriate narratives for yourself, would be a good thing. But perhaps a more important thing, or a bigger one for me personally, is that it leads to the wrong sorts of questions and thinking about literature, I think. So if you're fixated about the role of the author in the text, and you're coming to the text with this idea that this one particular person sat down and had this fixed set of ideas in mind, and then they wrote this book, and I want to kind of try to figure out like how the person and the ideas in the book are all related, then you ask questions like, what's the meaning of this work? What did the author have in mind when he was writing it? And those are genuine questions that a lot of people want to ask. But to me, they're not as interesting as the other questions you would ask if, instead of approaching the book that way, you thought of fiction as this thing which which has the capacity to portray a variety of different perspectives on a lot of different life situations. So if you're thinking of the book in a much more dynamic way like that, you'd ask things like, how real did the fiction feel to you? Was it representative of your reality? Or did it portray problems and questions that you find actually relevant and interesting to your life? Or do you feel enriched in some way as a result of the reading? These are much more open-ended questions, and to me more interesting. So, it's a different approach, not necessarily an inherently better one, but nonetheless, it's an effect that is had when, depending on how you view the author when you go into reading the book. Okay, so now let's think about or consider how these ideas of authorship play out in Elegiac Conclusion by Bloom. Clearly, Bloom has this total pure love for literature, and so that would seem to suggest that the author doesn't matter at all to him, because if it's truly your priority to just read the best books that there are, it shouldn't matter who wrote them. You just want to find the good stuff. But of course, the concept of authorship does crop up in Bloom's writing. So one positive way that it's kind of implicitly there, or one could put it in there, is in the idea of cultural preservation. So what I mean by that is, if you are convinced that Macbeth is the pinnacle of literary greatness, for example, then it would actually be a really good idea to establish an author for Macbeth, even if you didn't even know like who had written it. It would just be good to say, this is Macbeth. It was written by, let's say, Shakespeare, and like define it clearly, demarcate it, because then like people can't reappropriate it, they can't change it, and if it's really so good, those changes are probably going to be bad, right? And so establishing an author for Macbeth, for example, acts as cultural preservation. This is a positive thing, if you're of the same mind as Bloom. Unfortunately, that's not the only function that authorship could serve if you're using the concept in the same way that Bloom does. So Bloom says, quote, "The arts are not progressive." And unfortunately, that's partially, like, if that's, to the extent that that's true, it's because of Bloom's understanding and appeals to authorship, or the understanding and appeals to authorship that people like him have. So what I mean is he uses the social cachet from citing like Shakespeare and Proust and Chaucer to give like some credence. Like he gets social cachet from mentioning those people because they're well respected, right? And then in turn, he uses that social cachet to give more credence to exactly those same people, Shakespeare and Proust and Chaucer. And so this creates like this impenetrable elite of authors, which makes it impossible for progressive or new authors to ever join. And that's a real shame.